All right, in this section, we're going to go over the lipoprotein metabolism. And just as a review before we get started, what we see here is what we've talked about so far. It's a good summary and review of the lipid and cholesterol digestion and absorption. So if you remember, we talk about you digest, you eat food, you digest the food. It gets broken down into free fatty acids and free cholesterol in your intestinal lumen. And then it gets absorbed into the small intestinal wall. Inside the wall, it gets broken down into the triglyceride, gets broken down or gets repackaged. The free fatty acids and cholesterol gets repackaged into a chylomicron. And the chylomicron is excreted into the lymphatic channels before it moves into the blood. Then the chylomicron makes its way into the liver. Some of those the chylomicrons are used to make bile acids and phospholipids, which will be used to make new micelles to allow for the cycle to continue. So this is a review so far. Essentially, steps 1 through 6 are a review. What we're now going to talk about is step number 8. What happens in between meals? Because essentially 1 through 7 occurs right after a meal. So now we're going to move on and talk about what happens to in between meals and what does the liver do with the chylomicrons, the triglycerides that were brought into the liver by the chylomicrons. What does it do with them in between the meals? So what we have here, essentially step number 1 here is a step number 8 in this slide here. So again, step 8 here is step number 1 here. So in between meals, when your body needs triglycerides to deliver the free fatty acids to the tissues for energy, what happens is the liver takes up those triglycerides and says, hey, we're going to make very low density lipoprotein triglycerides and secrete it into the blood. And so that what we see here is the first step is those VLDL triglycerides are secreted into the blood. Well, that VLDL triglyceride carrying will travel through the body and go to the capillaries of the various parts of the body. In our case, the skeletal muscle. And what happens is the capillaries, the wall of the capillaries make an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. And what this lipoprotein lipase does is it starts to strip away the triglycerides from the VLDL. And what happens is that tissue then will take the triglycerides and use that triglyceride for energy to make ATP. Well, what happens with that VLDL when it loses its triglyceride is it becomes what's called an intermediate density lipoprotein. The intermediate density lipoprotein has 2 fates. Some of them can remain in the blood, but most of them will return back to the liver. Inside the liver, what happens is the liver will attach more cholesterol to the IDL, and that changes the IDL into what's called the LDL, or the low density lipoprotein. The LDL then is going to be excreted into the blood and it's going to circulate. What happens is the LDL then will continue to circulate until it goes to the tissues of the body. Remember, the role of the LDL is to deliver cholesterol to the tissues of the body. In this particular case, the LDL will be taken up by the tissue, and then the LDL, through a process called receptor-mediated endocytosis, which we'll talk about later. But inside the tissue, the LDL will be broken down through a process that we'll get to in a little bit. But what happens is that any unused cholesterol that the tissue does not need, it actually excretes it back out into the blood, as shown in number 6. These steps we're going to skip. This has to do with what is happening in step number 5 in the tissues. We'll get back to that in just a little bit. So we're going to move through these slides and we'll come back to those in a minute. Continuing on with number 7, what you see here is that now that the cholesterol is circulating in the body, in the blood, HDL that's low in cholesterol that has just left the liver is going to pick up that excess cholesterol and take it back to the liver. Think of HDL as like a taxi and the cholesterol being its passengers. And so the HDL will come in and pick up the excess cholesterol, its passengers, and then it'll take it back to the liver. What happens is the cholesterol is going to be stripped of its, the HDL will be stripped of its cholesterol. Some of that cholesterol is going to be used to make new LDLs, while some of that cholesterol is used to make bile. Now the HDL that's going to be low in cholesterol will return to the blood to pick up excess cholesterol. The half-life or the functioning life of an HDL is about 48 hours or about 2 days, after which the HDL is no longer functional. So what we see here is we see the process of the lipoprotein metabolism. So again, we begin here with the VLDL being secreted in the blood. It gets broken down by lipoprotein lipase at the capillaries, stripping some of its triglycerides so the tissue can use it for energy. What's remaining is the IDL. Some of the IDL can remain in the liver, or remain in the blood, while most of it actually returns to the liver. Inside the liver, cholesterol is added to the IDL and it becomes an LDL. And the LDL then will make its way to the peripheral cells, delivering much needed cholesterol to the tissues. And through the process we'll get to in a moment, the tissue will use whatever cholesterol it needs. Any unused cholesterol will be excreted into the blood. An HDL circulating in the blood will pick up the cholesterol, excess cholesterol, and take it back to the liver, where the liver is going to either use that cholesterol to make new LDLs or be used to make new bile. And that HDL that's now low in cholesterol will return to the blood to repeat the process. So this is the overview of the lipoprotein metabolism. I'd encourage you to pause the video, put these steps in your own words. There's also practice on Blackboard for you to put these in the correct order to give you some practice so you're ready for the exam. So at this point, I'd recommend pausing the video or wait till this section is over and then do some practice, making sure that you have a good understanding of the lipoprotein metabolism. And these are just the words of what we just talked about. You can find in your slides. Okay. One last thing here is that there's a thing called familiar hypercholesterolemia. And if you know that the normal level of cholesterol is less than 200 milligrams per deciliter, however, there are situations in which the LDL or the LDL is much higher than normal. And the reason for that is that the LDL is not picked up by the tissue. And as a result, the LDL levels can be much higher. And in some cases, it could be as high as 1,000, anywhere from 500 to 1,000. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But for now, what you need to do is make sure that you have a good understanding of the lipoprotein metabolism, and then do some practice before we move on to what's happening here in step number 5 and expanding on what's happening at the tissues.